Hey guys, and welcome back. If you are new around here, I cover mostly Australian cases, but today we're going to be covering something a little bit different. At some point last year, I asked you guys if you would like to see stories of survival here on my channel, and it seemed a lot of you did. So here we are. And in my opinion, this story of survival is probably one of the greatest of the last century. So if you are unfamiliar with this tale of survival, well, buckle in. As the title suggests, a plane crash occurs in the brutal Andes Mountains, in which survivors were eventually forced to eat their deceased friends to survive. But there is so much more to this story than that aspect, so I hope you'll stick around to hear the entire incredible story I'm about to tell you. But first, I would like to thank our very loyal sponsor for today for working with me again and supporting what I do here on the channel, and that is Skillshare. So you guys know by now how much I love Skillshare, but if you are unfamiliar with what it is, Skillshare is an online learning community with a difference. You're sure to find a course on Skillshare that suits you and find a community that shares your passion. Whether that be photography, art, languages, cooking, gardening, entrepreneurship, or business. I could go on. Skillshare can help you achieve your goals. I've talked to you in previous videos about the courses I have been loving recently that are very much to do with improving my everyday life. I've done courses on daily productivity, on how to improve my channel through storytelling, but recently I thought I'd take a look at the more fun and creative ones. And that's when the title, The Perfect Grilled Cheese, a mini class to master the sandwich, seriously caught my attention. I'm not exactly much of a chef, so a grilled cheese sandwich is often my easy go-to for lunch or dinner. Anyway, turns out I've been making a pretty subpar grilled cheese sandwich for years. This super quick and fun 10-minute course run by head chef Elena Karp runs you through how to make the perfect grilled cheese, obviously, and shares her one secret ingredient that makes it, well, perfect. I won't tell you what it is here. You're going to have to check out Skillshare for yourself to find that out. Elena also mentions a few other kitchen tips and tricks, so if you're a bit of a kitchen amateur like myself, you're really going to appreciate this course. So if you love grilled cheese sandwiches, and who doesn't? And if you're interested in checking out Skillshare, luckily for you, Skillshare is giving away 2 free months of premium membership to the first 500 people who click the link down in my description box to help you explore your creativity, and after that it's only around $10 a month, which is an insanely good price for how much is offered on the Skillshare website. You guys know how much I love Skillshare, so please consider checking them out, because by supporting our wonderful sponsors, you also support the content I do right here on the channel. So having said all of that, let's get into this tale of survival. So we're going to be heading back to the year of 1972. A rugby union team made up of friends from Montevideo in Uruguay have an upcoming match against an English team in Santiago, Chile. Now, because we have so many people in this story, I'm going to be focusing on 2 individual stories. So keep these names in your mind. Roberto Canessa, who was just 19 years old at the time, and 22-year-old Nando Parado. Please forgive me throughout this video if I pronounce anything wrong. I have looked everything up and I'm doing the best I can. So to get from Uruguay to Chile for the game, the team booked a flight on a chartered Air Force twin turboprop aircraft called the Fairchild FH-227D. The Fairchild, which was a small 56-seater aircraft, was the cheapest option to get the team from Uruguay to Chile, which is likely why they chose to book it. And what the team likely did not know at this time was just how dodgy the Fairchild aircraft was. It had a shocking safety record, in fact. Out of the 78 Fairchild 227s produced, 23 of them had been in accidents, resulting in 393 total fatalities. That's 1/3 of their fleet that has met an untimely end. And that's not good odds in my books. I should also mention that this particular aircraft, the team was only 4 years old, so not worn out by any stretch. So let's discuss the day of departure. Air Force Flight 571 departed Uruguay on October the 12th with a total of 40 passengers and 5 crew on board. The passengers were made up of the rugby team, plus some of the team members had invited along friends and family for the quick trip, so it was a very exciting flight, and most on board were good friends. Unfortunately, due to a storm over the Andes Mountains, Flight 571 was forced to stop over in Mendoza, Argentina, and spend the night. The team woke up the next day on Friday, October the 13th, to even more bad news. Conditions over the Andes had not improved, so the pilots devised an alternative route to get them there safely. At 2:18 p.m. that afternoon, Flight 571 was finally headed for its final destination of Santiago, Chile. The team were in high spirits and enjoying their flight with friends and family. Nando Parado, who I mentioned earlier, was enjoying his view of the Andes from his window seat when a teammate asked him if he could swap seats with him so he would have a chance to see out of the window as well. Nando agreed, having no idea that this decision would save his life. As the pilots flew through the Andes Mountains, their view was obscured by clouds, therefore they couldn't visually confirm their location to air traffic control. The only indication the pilots had as to their location was from a digital reading in the flight deck that told them that their closest radio beacon was Curacao, Chile. At 3:21 p.m. after transitioning the pass being where the pilots are handed off from one traffic control tower to the next. In this case, they were handed off from Mendoza to Santiago. So at this point, the pilots contacted the air traffic control tower in Santiago and told them that they'd be reaching Curacao in 1 minute. However, this made no sense, as it was 11 minutes from the pass to Curacao. 3 minutes later, the pilots contacted air traffic control again to tell them they were now passing Curacao and requested permission to begin descent, unaware that they were nowhere near where they believed they were. Air traffic control gave them permission to begin their descent, and they had no idea that they were still amongst the high peaks of the Andes Mountains. I hope all this is making sense. There was so much information as far as all the aviation technicalities to get through. I really tried to, to compact it and make it simple so it wasn't boring for you guys, so let me know if you've been following along. This is when passengers and crew began to experience some pretty severe turbulence, which they initially weren't too concerned with. That was until the plane suddenly dropped several hundred feet to below the clouds that obscured their view. Crew and passengers looked out of their window after this drop and realised that below the clouds they were flying dangerously close to the peaks of the Andes Mountains. At this point, the aircraft's ground collision alarms began to ring out, and this really set off a panic in the cabin. The pilots applied a maximum power to try and gain some altitude, but with no luck, and at 3:34 p.m, Flight 571 hit a mountain peak tearing off the tail of the plane with 5 passengers inside. What happened after this is somewhat miraculous, although I don't think that is quite the right word, as of course there were people that didn't survive this crash. I should also add that the way in which I am explaining how the actual accident happened is a very simplified version of events, but I really wanted to focus on the survival aspect of this story as opposed to the aviation technicalities. And the survival aspect of this story is so huge that I didn't want this video to be hours and hours long. I really wanted to keep it quite compacted because I just personally prefer when stories aren't too long and drawn out, which is what I'm doing right now. Babbling away, wasting time, let's keep going. So the remaining half of the aircraft, or the fuselage, was flung forward and up several hundred meters, at which point the wings were torn off, before it eventually landed in the snow and glided down the mountain. Well, maybe glided is too eloquent of a description, but it sledded down the snow-covered Andes Mountains like a toboggan at 350 k's or 270 miles per hour for just over 700 meters or 2,300 feet before coming to a halt when it collided with a snowbank. Also, let me know down below, do you guys prefer when I verbally translate, is that the right word? Translate metrics for you, feet to meters, kilos to pounds, or would you rather me put that up on the screen? Let me know. Incredibly, the fuselage didn't hit any rocks on its way down the mountain. And even more incredible, besides how much of the plane was still intact, was the fact that passengers had survived the crash. The plane had landed in an area of the Andes Mountains so remote that it was unnamed at the time, resting at 3,570 meters or 11,710 feet above sea level in the Mendoza province, a province of Argentina. The plane was sitting roughly 80 kilometers or 50 miles off course to the east, but of course none of the passengers or crew knew this at the time. They had absolutely no idea where in the Andes Mountains they had landed. In total, 33 of the 45 passengers survived the initial impact, but many were critically injured, and add to that the altitude making it hard to breathe, and of course the freezing temperatures. The co-pilot was in so much pain from his injuries, he insisted that the passengers locate his pistol and shoot him to put him out of his pain. But they refused and he passed away a short time after. The captain had also died on impact. Before the co-pilot died, he had told survivors the location he believed they were, which I will get into later. Those that had received minimal injuries attempted to help those that had been more severely injured. Roberto Canessa, whom I mentioned before, was one of the survivors that was very active in helping, as he had been a medical student at the time. Nando Parado was presumed dead from the impact and laid out in the snow with the other passengers who did not survive the crash. He was in fact in a coma. I don't understand the science behind it, but apparently the hypothermia from being placed in the snow while in a coma was in fact what kept him alive. Nando had also invited his mother and sister on this trip. His sister was alive but had serious injuries, and his mother had passed away on impact. The survivors had believed that search and rescue would be there to save them within a matter of hours, or at the very least by the following morning. But as it became clear they'd have to spend at least one long, freezing night in the Andes Mountains, they started to raid the luggage for warmer clothing and began layering up. After all, nobody had dressed appropriately for the freezing temperatures of the Andes, which were, by the way, minus 30 degrees Celsius on that first night, or minus 22 degrees Fahrenheit. The survivors set up camp for the night inside the fuselage, which also doubled as a shelter from the chilly outside conditions. They rugged up and remained close together as they slept, relying on each other's body heat to keep them warm enough to survive the night. Despite this, 5 people passed away on that first night. So let's talk about the rescue efforts. The Chilean search and rescue were put in charge of finding Flight 71. They were notified within an hour of the aircraft going missing and searched for it until night fell. By day 2, the search intensified, with 11 total aircrafts out looking for Flight 571. Little did SARS, Search and Rescue, know they were flying incredibly close to the site of the crash. So close that the survivors could actually see the rescue planes, but the rescue planes could not see them. Unfortunately, the plane's white fuselage blended in with the snowy white mountains and could not be spotted from the air. Passengers even attempted to write SOS on top of the aircraft with lipstick found in the passengers' luggage, but they soon realised they were going to need many more tubes of lipstick to make letters big enough and bold enough to be seen from the sky. The survivors had also found a small transistor radio that they had managed to get up and running and used it to listen to transmissions about the rescue efforts. On day 3, Nando Parado awoke from his coma, much to the shock and surprise of the other survivors, only to find that his mother had died and his sister, 19-year-old Susanna, was near death. On day 8, Nando lost his beloved sister, whom he had been attending to since awaking from the coma. She died in his arms, which he said was his only comfort at the time. During the first 1 to 2 weeks, the survivors had begun to set up a pretty decent shelter as they waited to be rescued. They removed the plane seats and any other junk from the fuselage and built a fort, if you will. They also used luggage and seats to keep the cold from blowing into the open end of the broken aircraft. The survivors, most of which had 0 survival skills in these conditions, became very nifty at finding ways to survive and improvise. They solved the most pressing issue, lack of water, by building a funnel with a metal sheet that they had found to exist under every passenger seat and folded it to create the funnel that would allow snow to drip and melt in the sun and into empty wine bottles, hence creating bottles of water. The survivors also had another problem. They only had 3 pairs of sunglasses between them, which you would think would be a non-issue in their situation. But apparently snow blindness is a thing, and living in Australia, I unsurprisingly know nothing about it. I'm assuming it has something to do with the sun reflecting off the white of the snow and pretty much frying your cornea. Let me know down below if that's correct. So because of this, they were forced to improvise their own sunglasses, which they very cleverly did out of sun visors, wire and a bra strap. They also used the wool of seat covers as insulation to keep them warm, and seat cushions with seat belts as snowshoes. The survivors really did utilise anything and everything they could to survive. The other major problem was the lack of food, which was dwindling away very quickly, even with everyone strictly rationing what they had. And what they did have, if you were wondering, were 8 chocolate bars, a tin of mussels, 3 small jars of jam, and a tin of almonds, plus a few dates, candies, and dried plums, and a few bottles of wine. Nando later said he made a single chocolate-coated peanut last him for 3 days. The situation started to become desperate as the food was getting down to almost nothing. The survivors even started pulling apart parts of the aircraft to look for items that may be edible, like cotton or leather, but decided against eating these items, believing it would likely make them sicker in the long run. And there was also absolutely nothing surrounding them but snow and mountains. No animals, no plants, nothing whatsoever to sustain them. On day 10, survivors heard devastating news through the transistor radio. The search efforts for their plane had been called off. It was not believed that anyone could have survived a crash in the Andes, and if they had, they would not still be alive. At this news, many wept and prayed, while others came to the realization the only way they were going to get off the Andes Mountains was if they found a way out of there themselves. After hearing the news that the search had been called off, having near no food left and 27 starving people, survivors came up with a solution that many could not bear the thought of. At first, many kept the idea to themselves. Then they began to whisper with their closest confidants about it, and finally the group sat down to discuss what would be the only solution to ensure their survival for the foreseeable future. They must eat the dead. The decision was made even harder by the fact that many of the survivors had friends and family amongst the dead, but it was either eat the bodies or die in the Andes Mountains. Now, technically, there isn't anything wrong with eating another human, on the health side of things at least. The meat is a source of protein, and the deceased had been placed in the snow outside, meaning their bodies were frozen and preserved. However, morally, some of the survivors had an issue with it. Many did not want to partake for religious reasons. Other survivors tried to convince them by likening it to a church service where you eat the body and drink the blood of Christ. I'm not religious, I don't know much about this, but I believe that's correct. Still, those that took a religious stance, although as hard as they tried to justify it, they wrestled with the fear of eternal damnation. This quote from Roberto Canessa sums up what was likely going through his head and many others at the time. For a long time, we agonized. I went in the snow and prayed to God for guidance. Without his consent, I felt I would be violating the memory of my friends, that I would be stealing their souls. We wondered whether we were going mad to even contemplate such a thing. Had we turned into brute savages? Or was this the only sane thing to do? Truly, we were pushing the limits of our fear. Roberto himself had accepted that to survive, they must eat the dead. So he set an example to his fellow survivors, if you will, by eating the first small piece of human flesh, starting with the pilots, as none of the survivors had personally known them. He used broken glass from the aircraft windshield and carved it into a knife using the plane's crash axe. Several others followed in his footsteps, but many initially refused the food or simply could not keep it down. Within days, everyone would succumb to the unbearable hunger pangs and eat human flesh. Survivors attempted to lay the meat out in the sun to dry in an attempt to make it a touch more edible, and as supplies of skin and fat wore thin, they began to eat other parts of the body until only the skeleton remained. The survivors had agreed amongst themselves by this point that if any one of them were to die, they gave permission for the rest of them to eat their remains. Nando had insisted, however, on protecting his deceased mother and sister. His mindset on this did change later on, but I'll talk about that in a bit. So I personally cannot imagine myself having to do what they did. The thought alone makes me unwell. But if that was the only way you were able to survive, you'd have to think mind over matter, which is what I assume that every survivor eventually had to do while they were eating the people they once knew. I should also add in here that those that participated in eating the human flesh don't like the term cannibalism to be used in reference to what they did. They all agreed that they had one common goal, and that was to survive. And they did what they had to do to achieve this goal. I think cannibalism implies something more violent or maybe vicious, even though that's not the technical meaning. In this day and age, I'm going to say that when we hear the term cannibalism or cannibal, we don't associate it with anything positive. On the night of October the 29th, roughly 2 weeks into their time on the Andes Mountains, tragedy struck. As the survivors slept in the fuselage that night, an avalanche came roaring down the mountains. They would later describe the unfamiliar sound barreling towards them as a stampede of horses. And I can only assume, with the little to no experience the survivors had in snowy conditions, the idea of an avalanche would have not even been a thought in their mind. It certainly wouldn't have crossed mine in that situation. So the avalanche came down the mountain and over the fuselage and into the fuselage, filling what had once been the survivors' shelter with snow and burying everyone alive. Some managed to crawl out and attempted to dig the others out. Meanwhile, Nando found a metal pole from the luggage racks and used it to poke a hole in the roof to provide ventilation, although it was still incredibly difficult to breathe in the snow-filled fuselage. That night, 8 people were killed, leaving 19 remaining. 2 days later, they dug their way out, only to find a terrible blizzard waiting for them on the outside. They had no choice but to remain in the snow-filled fuselage. 3 days into being stuck in the very cramped area in the fuselage, the remaining survivors had no choice but to begin eating the friends that they had just lost to the avalanche. As tragic as the loss had been, it would provide those remaining with enough sustenance to continue on. The event left survivors feeling even more helpless and discouraged. The avalanche was somewhat of a turning point for survivors. They knew the only way they were going to get out of this situation is if they began hiking, which seemed impossible. Many believed if they even attempted to hike through the Andes, they were sure to die. It would be a death sentence. After all, they didn't have the proper hiking equipment, and add to that, they were all very weak from lack of proper nutrition, some more than others. But after the terrifying avalanche, hiking away from the fuselage was beginning to look like more and more of a good idea. After all, what choice did they have? The alternative was to die where they were. I'm sure the survivors also became acutely aware of the fact that if an avalanche could come out of nowhere once and kill 8 of them, it could happen again. It was only a matter of time. So as I said earlier, the survivors had no idea where they were besides being on the Andes Mountains. The co-pilot had told survivors before he passed away that the plane had just passed Curacao before crashing, leading survivors to believe they were fairly deep into the Chilean side of the Andes, and the Chilean countryside lay west over some tall mountain peaks that they could not see past. Little did they know, the Chilean countryside was actually 89 kilometres in the opposite direction, or 55 miles. What survivors also didn't know at the time was that if they hiked east 28 kilometres or 18 miles, and not that that's any small feat of course, they'd reach an abandoned summer resort called Hotel Termas, I believe it's pronounced, or Termas. I'll pop it on screen. However, it had been abandoned for 20 years at this point, so nobody was residing there. But it would have supplied survivors with a solid shelter, safe from avalanches. There was also a river they would have had to have crossed before getting to the hotel, so it's unlikely they would have actually made it to the hotel regardless. I did read some internet tidbits saying the hotel had canned food, but considering it had been abandoned for 20 years, I doubt there is much truth to this. Over the next several weeks, as the sun melted away the damage the avalanche had done to the fuselage, survivors continued contemplating a huge hike west to the Chilean countryside, but embarked on smaller expeditions in the meantime, as practice, I suppose. Survivors had attempted mini expeditions previously, but a combination of altitude sickness, snow blindness, dehydration, the temperature, a lack of equipment, and malnourishment prevented them from getting more than a few hundred meters away from site. But as survivors began to improvise more equipment from the supplies they could gather, they thought maybe they had a chance at surviving a hike through the Andes. One of these smaller expeditions took place in mid-November, now 1 month since the plane had crashed into the Andes Mountains. Not all of the survivors would be chosen to go on these hikes, only the strongest, both physically and mentally, would go. Nando and Roberto were obvious choices. They were smart, strong, and they were leaders. On November 15, Nando, Roberto, and one other hiked for several hours, seeing how far they could get, until they stumbled across something that they had been looking for: the tail end of the aircraft. Inside, they found a few exciting items, including a box of chocolates, a bottle of brandy, cigarettes, a camera, more clothing, comic books, and some medicine, and most significant of all, some batteries. And as a side note, on the camera, the survivors actually used it to take pictures of themselves, which is why photos exist of their time on the Andes. They thought that maybe in the future people would find the crash site, find their remains, and see on the camera roll that people had lived and survived on the mountains for a period of time after the crash. Anyway, to celebrate this small win of finding a few new supplies, the trio set up camp for the night in the tail, where they drank brandy, ate chocolate, and read comic books, which sounds like a great night. The next morning, they made the decision to take the batteries they had found and head back to the fuselage in an attempt to use the batteries to power up the radio and call for help. Everyone was very excited at the prospect of a potential radio signal, so spirits that day were high. Amongst the survivors was even an amateur electronics enthusiast named Roy Harley, who thought he may be able to help in connecting the batteries to the radio. However, the entire mission proved unsuccessful, as the task at hand proved to be far more complicated than any of the survivors had the knowledge to solve, and they simply did not have the tools to deal with the amount of wiring they had encountered. Hopes of the remaining 18 survivors were once again crushed. November soon turned to December, and by this point, several more of the survivors had passed away. One survivor, who had struggled to eat the human flesh, passed away at just 25 kilos or 55 pounds. The remaining survivors were all acutely aware that they would eventually be picked off one by one, succumbing to some kind of ailment or illness if they did not act immediately. What was preventing survivors embarking on a mammoth hike to find civilization was the fact that they knew if they were forced to hike for days, they would not be able to survive the night's freezing temperatures. They'd literally be sleeping in the snow without any kind of shelter. So one of the remaining survivors, Carlitos Paez, devised a pretty ingenious plan to solve this problem, or should I say, a device. Taking various parts of the plane, he created a sleeping bag that would be highly insulated and protect them from the elements. He took insulation from the rear of the fuselage, some copper wire, and a waterproof fabric from the air conditioner as his materials. The sleeping bag was sewn together by Carlitos with a needle and copper wire, and eventually the sleeping bag was complete, and Nando, Roberto, and another survivor named Antonio Vizatin, nicknamed Tintin, were chosen to head out on the mammoth hike to the Chilean countryside. Before leaving for the expedition, Nando, who had been insistent on protecting the bodies of his mother and sister, told the remaining survivors if it came down to it, if they had to, they had his blessing to eat their remains to survive. On the 12th of December, 2 months after the plane had crashed, and with 16 survivors remaining, the three men chosen set out on their hike west to find civilization. However, as I said earlier, where they thought they were based on what the pilot had told them was incorrect. They chose to head west, believing that they were sitting on the western edge of the mountains near Curacao, and that Chile was in that direction. One large 15,000-foot mountain peak blocked their view of what lay ahead, however. So the real challenge for the three men was going to be to hike over that. The trio took with them about 3 days worth of food, the human flesh, placed inside some socks, believing that this would be how long it would take them to reach their destination. They had no specialised gear as well as no hiking experience, yet they were about to climb a mountain peak that sat at a steep 45 degrees. Not only did the climb prove to be incredibly difficult, but it took longer to complete than they had anticipated. What was predicted to be a one-day climb turned into 3. The sleeping bags, however, did work, and the men survived each night on the mountain. The other survivors could actually see the trio climbing the mountain from where they were by the fuselage as a little black speck in the distance, so they were fully aware of just how slow and difficult the climb was for them and how much longer it was taking than anticipated, which, as you can imagine, was quite a worry. On day 3, when they finally reached the mountain's peak, they were shocked and stunned to be met with more snow-covered mountains, rolling out as far as the eye could see. They had expected to see the green valleys of Chile and city lights gleaming on the horizon. It was a severe blow to their plan and to their confidence. After this, the 3 men made the decision that given that they were very low on food, one of them had to return to the fuselage. The man chosen was Antonio, who gave his supply of food and his extra clothing to Roberto and Nando before leaving. Antonio flew back down the mountain and back to the remaining survivors, where he shared with them the terrible news of what they saw over the mountain peak. The 2 remaining men decided to continue west after Nando spotted 2 small mountain peaks in that direction that were not covered in snow, and they could also see no more mountain peaks beyond that point. These peaks they saw in the distance were in reality 96 kilometers or 60 miles away. I suspect everything looks closer when all you can see is snowy white mountain peaks blurring together. Nando said to his good friend before they continued, "We may be walking to our deaths, but I would rather walk to meet my death than wait for it to come to me." Roberto responded, "We have been through so much, now let's die together." The pair continued hiking for days, descending as they headed towards the valleys in the distance. They eventually found a river that they followed, which led them to the snow line, the snow line being the point in which the snow ends. I should also mention, as they hiked into the warmer climates, their food began to rot and became inedible. Luckily, they soon reached vegetation. By day 9, they'd spotted a cow and evidence that people had been camping in the area that they had reached. That evening, as the pair began to settle in for the night, lo and behold, across the river was a real-life, actual human being. They'd finally reached some form of civilization. Nando attempted to shout to the man who had been on horseback, but the noise of the river made it impossible for communication, and the river was in no way crossable. The man shouted back to them, "Tomorrow," and rode away on his horse. The next morning, the man on horseback returned. He came carrying a rock with a piece of paper around it and a pencil attached with a string, and threw the rock across the river so the 2 tired and malnourished men in the middle of nowhere could tell the puzzled horseback rider who they were and what they were doing in the middle of nowhere. Nando wrote this on the paper. "I come from a plane that fell from the mountains. I am Uruguayan. We've been walking for 10 days. I have a friend up here who is injured. In the plane there are still 14 injured people. We have to get out from here quickly and we don't know how. We don't have any food. We are weak. When are you going to come fetch us? Please, we cannot even walk. Where are we?" This was of course originally in Spanish, and by the way, where they were was Los Matins, a valley in the Andean foothills of Chile. The man on horseback, Sergio Catalan, a Chilean muleteer, which is a person that transports goods using pack animals, if you were curious, was shocked upon reading the note. He threw the men bread and cheese across the river before riding away on his horse, travelling for 10 hours to find the men help. Eventually, a very relieved Nando and Roberto were greeted by military men on horseback. It was December 21, and it had been 71 days since the crash. The military men helped the very frail Nando and Roberto onto the back of their horses and took them back to civilization to recover. In total, Nando and Roberto hiked across the Andes Mountains for 10 days and covered 64 k's or 40 miles on foot in some of the most treacherous conditions, with absolutely no training, no experience, and no specialized equipment. I feel like this is the perfect example of the determination of the human spirit and our will to live. After news broke that people had actually survived the suspected crash of Flight 571 into the Andes, news reporters from around the world descended into Chile to hear the tale of survival from Nando and Roberto. They asked the frail men questions such as what they ate to survive, which they did not answer. The Chilean army were provided with 3 helicopters to assist with the rescue, and Nando, using a map, offered to help find the missing aircraft. When Nando pointed out on the map exactly where the aircraft was, they could hardly believe that the 2 men had hiked that far across the Andes with no equipment and barely any food. When helicopters flew over the terrain that Nando and Roberto had just spent 10 days hiking, they were shocked to see how difficult conditions had been and gobsmacked at how the 2 men had managed to survive. Back at camp, survivors rejoiced as they heard on the radio that Roberto and Nando had been found. On December the 22nd, the remaining survivors were finally rescued. It was Nando that had to point out the fuselage, as the white of the aircraft blended in so well that nobody could spot it, as had been the initial problem with the search and rescue 2 months earlier. Only half of the survivors could initially be taken, and the remaining 7 were forced to spend 1 more night on the Andes Mountains that had been their home for 72 days. 4 members of the search and rescue team volunteered to spend the final night with the final 7 survivors. Early the next morning, the remaining 7 were rescued. All of the survivors were taken to hospitals in Santiago for a variety of ailments and illnesses, and everyone that was rescued that day went on to survive. As the survivors healed in hospital, they confessed to a Catholic priest what they had been forced to do in the mountains: eat their friends. The priest told them that they were not condemned for what they had done, given the extreme circumstances. They were told they had done the right thing, which brought comfort to many of them. Not everybody took this stance, however, of forgiving the survivors for eating their friends in the name of survival and the preservation of human life, as the priest had. When word got out that the 16 survivors had survived by eating the dead, They were heavily judged by the public, particularly when the media falsely reported that they had purposefully killed people to eat and survive. Initially, the survivors had not planned to speak publicly about what they had to do to survive, planning to tell the media that they had survived off rations from the plane. In fact, the only people they had planned to tell were family members. Unfortunately, on December 23, headlines involving the survivors and cannibalism were printed worldwide, except in Uruguay. On December the 28th, survivors held a press conference where they spoke about their 72 days in the Andes and exactly what they had to do to survive. It was eventually decided that those that perished would be buried near the crash site, in a common grave, in an area that was thought to be safe from avalanches. A stone altar with an iron cross marks the gravesite, with a plaque that reads, "The world to its Uruguayan brothers, O God, to you." The aircraft's fuselage was set alight, with only the charred frame still remaining. The crash site has since become somewhat of a tourist attraction, attracting hundreds of visitors a year that travel to pay homage to those that survived and those that passed away. It's not exactly easy to get to, however, so if you are up that way and thinking about checking it out, maybe put aside a good week or so to hike there and back. There is also several books and movies out there about this incredible survival story. If you're interested, I'll link them down below. And that wraps up today's story. Thank you so much to my channel members. You're all absolute stars, and thank you for being here and for listening to this incredible survival story. Like, comment, share, subscribe. Spread the word. Thank you to Skillshare once again. Until next time, stay vigilant and stay safe. And I will see you next time. Bye guys.